The most effective way to control another person is to make them believe the decision was entirely their own. Not pressure them, not deceive them, not even persuade them. Just arrange the conditions carefully enough and let their own mind walk itself into the conclusion. Because the moment a person feels ownership over an idea, they stop defending themselves from it. They defend the idea itself. That is the real mechanism behind influence. Not dominance, not charm, not manipulation in the obvious sense. Something quieter, something far more difficult to detect while it's happening to you. Right now, today, there are people in your life, in your workplace, in the media you consume who understand this mechanism. And the disturbing part is this: you almost certainly don't know which moments they've already used it. 5 reversals, 5 psychological mechanisms. In 1966, psychologist Jack Brehm ran a deceptively simple experiment. Children were shown 4 toys and asked to rank them, most desirable to least. Then Brehm took one of the lower-ranked toys and placed it behind a transparent barrier. The children could still see it, still think about it. They just couldn't reach it. Minutes later, the children ranked that same toy as the one they wanted most. Nothing about the toy had changed. Only one thing changed: access. Brehm called this psychological reactance. The moment freedom feels threatened, the mind begins moving toward the restriction automatically. Tell a person they may lose something, and suddenly it becomes emotionally urgent. Tell them they can't have someone, and the attachment intensifies. Tell them a path is closed, and their attention locks onto it with unnatural force. Because the human ego has one obsession above almost everything else: the feeling that it chooses freely. And the instant that freedom feels threatened, the mind starts trying to reclaim it. Not rationally, emotionally. You've already felt this in your own life. Sometimes what felt like deep attraction was simply restriction wearing the mask of destiny. Reversal 1. The forbidden door. Every civilization tells the same story: the forbidden fruit, the sealed chamber, the door that must never be opened. Different cultures, different centuries, same psychological structure. Someone is warned, do not touch this. And immediately, something inside them moves toward it. Not because humans are irrational, because prohibition transforms attention. Machiavelli understood this with brutal precision. He wrote, "Men value more intensely what feels threatened than what was never theirs to begin with." The mind can accept absence, but restriction feels personal. Restriction creates emotional heat, and the moment emotional heat appears, desire begins rewriting itself. Watch how this works in ordinary life. The negotiator who needs your commitment rarely says, "This opportunity is perfect for you." Instead, he says, "I'm honestly not sure this fits someone in your position." The person who wants pursuit doesn't offer certainty. They create slight distance, controlled ambiguity, the feeling that access may disappear. And suddenly the emotional intensity rises. Not because reality changed, because the ego now experiences pursuit as proof of independence. I choose. No one controls me. Watch me decide. That internal narrative is powerful enough to override logic completely. This is why some relationships become addictive immediately after withdrawal. Why unavailable people often feel more emotionally magnetic than available ones. Why consumers chase products they ignored for months the instant they become limited edition. The object itself is often secondary. The restriction is the amplifier. And once you understand that, certain moments from your own past begin looking very different. Think carefully. Some desires in your life did not begin with attraction. They began the moment something became uncertain. That distinction matters, because reactance doesn't announce itself as manipulation. It announces itself as instinct, and instinct is trusted automatically. Reversal 2. The borrowed favor. In 2019, a startup founder in San Francisco had a problem. His most important investor, a man known for being cold, transactional, difficult, had turned subtly hostile. Not openly, just withdrawn, unresponsive. The founder's team told him, "Send something generous, a dinner, a gift, a public acknowledgement." The founder did something else entirely. He sent a short message asking the investor for advice on a decision that had nothing to do with money, a hiring dilemma, a cultural question about the company. The investor responded within the hour. The hostility never returned. That founder had stumbled onto something Benjamin Franklin understood 250 years earlier. Franklin once had a political rival who openly disliked him. Powerful, educated, socially influential. Most people would try to soften that hostility through generosity. Franklin did the opposite. He sent the man a short letter, asking to borrow a rare book from his private collection. The rival agreed. Franklin returned it days later with a brief note of gratitude, nothing more. And from that point forward, the hostility began dissolving. The rival became cooperative, warmer, eventually loyal. Franklin recorded the principle himself. A person who has once done you a favor is more likely to do you another. At first glance, this seems backward. Why would helping someone increase attachment to them? Because the human mind hates contradiction. I dislike this person. I just helped this person. Those two ideas cannot comfortably coexist, so the brain quietly edits the emotional story afterward. If I helped him, he must deserve it. But beneath that mechanism is something even deeper. People are starving for identities they rarely get to inhabit. The powerful want opportunities to feel genuinely generous. The emotionally guarded want to feel trusted with something real. The overlooked want to feel important, not flattered. Important. And when someone allows them to step into that role, the emotional attachment forms around the identity they experienced while helping you, not around the favor itself. This is why small requests can create disproportionate loyalty, not because the request mattered, because the role did. The person was briefly allowed to become someone they unconsciously wanted to be, and the mind remembers that feeling. Watch this in real life. The executive who claims not to care about recognition suddenly becomes deeply invested when asked for genuine guidance. The emotionally distant person softens after being trusted with something vulnerable. The person who prides themselves on independence becomes loyal the moment they're placed in the role of protector. The request is rarely the mechanism. The identity is. And once someone emotionally identifies with the role they played around you, the relationship quietly reorganizes itself. Reversal 3. The planted idea. In 1870, Otto von Bismarck needed France to declare war first. If Prussia attacked openly, the rest of Europe would intervene. So Bismarck chose something subtler. He intercepted a diplomatic message between the Prussian king and the French ambassador. The original message was calm, polite, forgettable. Bismarck edited it carefully. Not enough to fabricate it, just enough to alter its emotional texture. Soft language removed, politeness compressed. Neutral phrasing sharpened into perceived disrespect. Then he released the edited version publicly. France reacted exactly as he predicted. National outrage exploded, political pressure mounted, and France declared war themselves. That is what made the maneuver so effective. The decision felt self-generated. France believed they were defending national honor. They never experienced themselves as manipulated. This is one of the deepest principles in psychology. People resist conclusions they are handed, but they fiercely defend conclusions they believe they discovered themselves, which means skilled operators rarely push the final idea directly. They place fragments, observations, patterns, emotional cues. Then they let your own mind complete the construction. You seem calmer away from them. Interesting how differently people react when she's in the room. Funny, several successful people mentioned the same thing recently. 3 fragments, and your brain draws the line automatically. Because once the pattern feels self-generated, the ego begins protecting it. And the ego protects its own conclusions far more aggressively than any instruction handed from outside. This is the part most people don't want to sit with. If planted ideas genuinely feel identical to original thoughts, then how many of your strongest beliefs actually originated with you? How many ambitions were quietly installed through environments designed to shape desire before you were old enough to question it? How many fears were inherited before they ever felt personal? Because the most effective influence never feels like influence. It feels like realization. And realization is almost impossible to argue against once the ego has claimed ownership of it. 3 reversals: the forbidden door, the borrowed favor, the planted idea. 3 different surfaces, one underlying principle. Human beings resist pressure, but move powerfully toward what feels self-chosen. The ego doesn't want to feel controlled. It wants to feel like the author, and the people who understand that can often guide behavior without resistance ever appearing. The 4th reversal is the one I hesitated to include, because once you see how Augustus used it to quietly dismantle the most politically sophisticated Senate in Western history, you'll start recognizing it in places you really don't want to. Your workplace, your relationships, the people closest to you, and the question underneath all of it. If your mind can be moved without noticing, what would it actually take to become difficult to move? Augustus Caesar ruled the most powerful empire on earth for 44 years. He never called himself emperor. He held every title with visible reluctance. He publicly begged the Senate repeatedly to let him step down. He dressed simply, lived modestly, refused golden statues, and the Senate, the most politically sophisticated body in the ancient world, gave him more power every single time he asked for less. That is not a coincidence. That is a system. What happens when the person applying these mechanisms is the one standing closest to you? Not a historical figure, not a distant politician, someone in the room. 2 reversals, and the question everything in this series has been building toward. Reversal 4, the mask of weakness. Julius Caesar made one fatal mistake. He allowed Rome to see his ambition too clearly. The victories, the titles, the symbolism, the open accumulation of authority. By the time he crossed the Rubicon, the Senate no longer saw a protector. They saw a man becoming too large to control, and they killed him for it. Augustus watched this happen from a distance, then built his entire strategy around the inversion. Every time Rome offered him more authority, he hesitated. Every title, visible reluctance. Every expansion of power, public resistance. Every extraordinary privilege, performed discomfort. Again and again, the same message: I do not seek this. And something strange began happening inside the psychology of the Senate. The more Augustus appeared willing to step away from power, the more desperately Rome wanted him to keep it. Because once power stops looking aggressive, it starts feeling safe. Centuries later, psychology would discover a version of the same principle in a laboratory. In 1966, psychologist Elliot Aronson ran what became known as the Pratfall effect. Subjects listened to recordings of highly competent people answering difficult questions. Some performed perfectly, others performed brilliantly, but made one small, harmless mistake near the end. A spilled drink, an awkward stumble, a minor slip. And unexpectedly, the flawed performers were rated significantly more likable, not less competent, more human. Perfection creates distance. Small imperfection creates emotional access, because flawless people unconsciously trigger comparison, and comparison creates tension. But visible humanity relaxes the nervous system. The observer stops feeling threatened, which is why experienced operators rarely display full capability immediately. They underplay, understate, reveal harmless flaws strategically, not to appear weak, to appear safe. And safety lowers defenses faster than dominance ever can. But Augustus understood something even more sophisticated than visible imperfection. He didn't perform incompetence, he performed reluctance. That difference changes everything. Incompetence says, "I cannot carry this responsibility." Reluctance says, "I could carry it, but I don't hunger for it." And people trust restrained power far more than visible ambition, because restrained power allows the observer to feel in control of the exchange. The Senate never believed they were surrendering Rome to Augustus. They believed they were wisely choosing stability. That illusion made the transfer of power psychologically painless. Watch how often this appears in your own world. The executive who repeatedly talks about not wanting leadership often becomes the most trusted leader in the room. The person who appears slightly detached becomes more emotionally pursued than the one openly seeking attention. The individual who looks comfortable walking away gains invisible leverage over everyone trying to hold on, because desire chases restraint, and people instinctively move toward what appears emotionally self-contained, not realizing that self-containment itself can become one of the strongest forms of influence ever designed. Reversal 5. The Gifted Victory. In the 1990s, a young Steve Jobs returned to Apple after more than a decade away. The company was weeks from bankruptcy. The board was fractured. The engineers were demoralized. Jobs made a decision that puzzled observers at the time. He started attributing almost every product decision to the team around him. In interviews, in internal meetings, in product launches, he framed breakthroughs as things the team had figured out, not things he had directed. The team became fiercely loyal, not because Jobs had become humble, because he had given them ownership of the story. This dynamic has a name in political history, and it played out most visibly between Queen Victoria and two very different men. William Gladstone was brilliant, disciplined, intellectually formidable, exceptionally capable by any measure. Benjamin Disraeli was less impressive analytically, but Victoria trusted Disraeli far more deeply. Why? Because Gladstone tried to demonstrate his own intelligence. Disraeli reflected hers back at her. He framed political successes as extensions of her judgment. He treated her instincts as unusually perceptive. He made her feel central to the outcome, and the emotional effect was enormous. Victoria later explained the difference herself. Gladstone speaks to me as if I were a public meeting. Disraeli speaks to me as if I were the most important woman in England. That single distinction changed the balance of influence completely. People do not want to feel persuaded. They want to feel perceptive. They don't want to feel led. They want to feel like the person who independently arrived at the correct conclusion. This is why skilled negotiators rarely push aggressively for victory. They allow the other side to experience ownership of the outcome. The concession feels extracted. The insight feels discovered. The solution feels self-generated. And once the ego experiences ownership, it begins protecting the decision emotionally. That protection is incredibly powerful, because the human mind will scrutinize ideas forced onto it, but defend ideas attached to identity. This is the hidden architecture beneath many successful interactions. The skilled subordinate allows the boss to feel like the architect of the strategy. The experienced negotiator embeds the concession into the original structure from the beginning. The emotionally intelligent person lets others feel slightly more insightful, slightly more admired, slightly more victorious than reality strictly requires. And in exchange, they gain something far more valuable than visible credit. They gain voluntary cooperation. The outcome moves exactly where they intended, while the other person walks away emotionally satisfied. No resistance, no humiliation, no visible force, only alignment. This is why some of the most influential people in history appeared strangely unconcerned with recognition. Because recognition is visible, but control rarely is. And the person obsessed with receiving credit usually sacrifices the outcome trying to secure it, while the person willing to surrender visible ownership often walks away owning the outcome entirely. Most people will finish this video and immediately think, how can I use these techniques? That reaction misses the deeper point entirely, because every reversal in this series works through the same opening: the ego's need to experience itself as autonomous. The forbidden door works because restriction intensifies the need for freedom. The borrowed favor works because identity reshapes emotion after action. The planted idea works because the ego protects what feels self-generated. The mask of weakness works because safety lowers resistance. The gifted victory works because people defend conclusions attached to self-image. 5 different surfaces. 1 underlying mechanism: the need to feel. I chose this myself. And once you begin recognizing that mechanism, certain moments from your own life become difficult to ignore. Which desires intensified only after they became uncertain? Which relationships attached themselves to emotional hungers you didn't fully understand at the time? Which opinions now feel deeply personal, even though they may have entered your mind through environments specifically designed to shape them? Machiavelli understood manipulation politically. Jung understood it psychologically. Together they point toward the same unsettling truth. The greatest vulnerability in human nature is the desperate need to believe we are untouched by influence. The first sign that someone understands psychological influence is not their ability to use it on other people. It's their ability to catch it happening inside themselves, to feel the pull, the manufactured urgency, the engineered uncertainty, the subtle shaping of what you want, and stay conscious enough to pause before instinct takes over. Most people never develop that, because the strongest forms of influence don't feel violent. They feel natural. They feel reasonable. They feel like your own thoughts arriving in your own voice, which is precisely why they work. If something in this video landed differently than you expected, that's probably worth sitting with. I make videos about the mechanisms behind human behavior, not to turn you into a manipulator, but to make these patterns harder to run on you without your knowledge. If that's interesting to you, subscribe. And if this gave language to something you felt but never quite named, leave a like. That tells me to keep going deeper.